Racial Justice and Reconciliation's mission statement reads as follows. As a member of the Jesus movement, our mission is to dismantle individual and institutional racism by sharing resources and creating opportunities that inspire, and empower faith communities and the larger community, resulting in reconciliation and restoration of all God's people. So how do we do about doing this, you may ask? We do this by telling the truth of what has transpired. For how can be reconciled to another without an acknowledgement of a wrong that was done? We go about telling the truth through our pilgrimages, through our racial reconciliation workshops, and our speaker series, which is why you are here tonight. And we're delighted that you have joined us this evening. We have a wonderful speaker for you this evening, but before I introduced him, I would like to let you know that you can submit your questions through the chat box, which should be located at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them at the conclusion of the speaker's presentation. Dr. Carlos Alamon is the Deputy Director of the Hispanic Interests of Coalition of Alabama, known as HICA. HICA is a community development and advocacy organization that champions economic equality, civic engagement, and social justice for Latino and immigrant families in Alabama. Prior to joining HICA, Dr. Carlos was a professor of Latin American history at Samford University. Dr. Carlos currently serves on the board of directors for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, Red Mountain Park, University Council of Central Alabama, and the WBHM Friends. He previously served on the boards of HICA, Fiesta, and the Greater Birmingham Ministries. A first-generation immigrant of Nicaragua, Dr. Carlos grew up in San Francisco. He received his BA in History and Latin American Latino Studies from UC Santa Cruz and his PhD in History from Michigan State. Dr. Carlos enjoys spending time with his wife, Mercedes, their daughter, Amelia, and their dog, Lulu. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Carlos Alamon.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you for the kind introduction. I want to thank first the Commission on Racial Justice and Reconciliation for inviting me to speak today. I think it's an honor to be able to communicate and dialogue with you all and tell you a little bit about myself and the work that we do in Birmingham. And also in light of what's going on today and the context of the conversations that are taking place, I think it's only more timely that we discuss race in our country. So let me start off with just saying that I want to focus today a little bit on talking about Latinos in Alabama, right? Talking about the Hispanic community in our state, a little bit of why folks come, some of the challenges that we face, and then the work that we do at HICA to address some of these issues and concerns. So if we go to the next slide, please. A little brief bio about myself. Like you heard, I was born in Nicaragua. My family migrated to the United States. We were actually fleeing civil war in Nicaragua during the 1980s. And so we ended up in San Francisco. I was 3 years old when my family arrived to this country. I was a permanent resident from the age of about 9 till 34. So it took me 25 years to become a citizen. But I became a citizen about 5 years ago, 6 years ago now. I grew up in San Francisco in a really ethnically diverse, but predominantly Latino neighborhood. And then I was fortunate enough to get my degree at UC Santa Cruz and at Michigan State. And I arrived in Alabama to become a professor of history. I did that for 5 years. I had a really great experience, had great interactions with students and fellow faculty members, but ultimately felt compelled to serve my community and try to make more direct impact. And thus, when the opportunity presented itself, I jumped to the nonprofit world and now serve as Deputy Director of HICA. Go to the next slide, please. So let me tell you a little bit about demographics, right? And also explain a little bit about the terminology, right? So my community is called a variety of things, right? Throughout its history, Hispanic, Latino, and a current term that folks are really using to describe a more inclusive, not necessarily gendered term is Latinx, right? So I want to put some emphasis on why I use the X there, so that we're not talking only about Latinos or Latinas, but we're trying to be inclusive and non-binary, right? And of folks who may identify in a variety of ways in terms of gender. So in 1990, there were 24,000 Latinos living in Alabama. In 2000, that number jumped to 75,000. That was a 200% increase. 10 years ago, that number was 185,602, 145% increase. Alabama was part of a wave of a southeastern boom in terms of Latino immigration to the region. The greatest migration went to North Carolina, and you also saw some migration to Georgia and Alabama. The numbers, of course, weren't as large as in those states, but it was quite impactful for a community that had previously not really been present in this state. Latinos only make about 4% of the population here, but we're convinced that in 2020 that number has grown, and we'll see that after we're done counting the census. So a few reasons, or actually let me read this quote from Ray Moll, 2009, describing the impact of new immigration. New immigration has fueled the South's changing economy and altered its system of race relations. Black and white once defined the racial landscapes of the American South, but multicultural and multi-ethnic, rather than biracial, now describes society in many Southern places. I think that's still coming to fruition in Alabama. I was just telling some of the folks earlier, right before we started, that one of the challenges that my community faces is being caught between this racial dichotomy of black and white. And so often my community becomes rendered invisible. When we talk about race in Alabama, what we're really talking about is black and white. And it fails to take into account the rich, multi-ethnic, multiracial tapestry that actually does exist if you take into account Latinos, Asians, and also your historical Native American presence in the state. So I think that we're trying to address that. Now, as to why folks come, Jenny Smith in 2005 wrote that Latinos come looking for better wages and increasingly for safer, more tranquil places to raise their children. This is a critical point. Immigrants, like anyone, want the same things that most folks want, which is a great place to live, a job to work, and schools to send their children to, right? We're all trying to achieve tranquility, stability, and an opportunity to realize our aspirations and dreams. Now, a lot of folks come here because there were jobs available to them. So we're talking about the poultry processing industry, farm work, forestry, construction, landscape, and of course, a variety of service jobs, including domestic service, right? So those are the reasons why folks come. Now, we face quite a bit of challenges though in Alabama. This is a state that has historically not been prepared for an influx of migration or of folks who aren't native to the United States. So one of the things that we face is predominantly the issue we face is language access. Information is not available in languages other than English, right? So folks who come here sometimes are denied opportunities to embrace things that are offered to everyone else because they're simply not in Spanish or any other language. Immigration status is also a component and barrier that really affects folks' ability to integrate fully into our society. And poverty, right? Poverty is critical in limiting access to our community. Now, one of the things I will emphasize today, though, is HB 56 and the legacy of HB 56. HB 56 was passed in 2011 and was the nation's harshest anti-immigrant law, right? And that has implications for language access, immigration status, and the poverty of our community. If we go to the next slide, please. So the HB 56 Beeson-Hammond Alabama Taxpayer and Citizens Protection Act was signed in 2011. There you see former Governor Bentley signing it into law. And we'll go to the next slide. The bill was designed to make it difficult for immigrants to live here so that they would auto-deport themselves, right? Its intrinsic part of the law was to make life so impossible for folks that they would want to leave Alabama. And the bill quickly gained notoriety for outdoing Arizona, Georgia, and a bunch of other states that had similar restrictions and penalties levied on undocumented immigrants, as well as other citizens, community members, employers, and health and law enforcement agencies that assist, employ, or regulate them. In the next slide, we'll go over some of the provisions that are actually still active in the law. So law enforcement is required to check the immigration status of people who are jailed. This is really important if we are keeping up with the sanctuary city debate and how cities deal with immigrants in their communities and how they cooperate and collaborate with ICE, right? So right now, by law, they are required to communicate with ICE if they have someone in their custody that is in the country undocumented, regardless of the severity of the infraction for which they were arrested. Undocumented immigrants may be transferred as a result to immigration custody then. Law enforcement are required to check the immigration status of any person they stop, detain, or arrest of whom they reasonably suspect is in the country unlawfully. Now, I'll be frank here. I don't know how you can tell someone is in the country without authorization by just looking at them. So I think that this is allows for racial profiling of our community. Can we go back to the previous slide, please? Also, undocumented immigrants are not permitted to enroll in or attend any public colleges and universities in Alabama. This is, of course, a challenge for folks who have, for most of their lives, been raised in the United States, have been raised in Alabama, are American thoroughly, except on paper. And these young folks are unable to attend college and thus really take full can really fully enjoy the benefits of being in this country. That is different for folks who have DACA, which was the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And we'll find out this week if those folks will be able to enjoy those benefits depending on the ruling of the Supreme Court. The law also required individuals to prove their lawful status in order to apply for and receive driver's licenses, any kind of identification cards, motor vehicles, business licenses, commercial licenses. So this really makes it difficult for folks to live their lives currently, right? There are folks in our community right now that are entrepreneurs and are unable to procure a business license because they don't have an Alabama driver's license. And so that's an ongoing challenge. Go to the next slide, please. Now, HECA was the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit that sued the state over HB 56. We joined with the ACLU, SPLC, and Alabama Appleseed and other organizations to sue the state to overturn the law, and we were successful in dismantling some of its most severe provisions. So you have, it was requiring schools to verify the immigration status of newly enrolled K-12 students, really endangering the opportunity for young children to get educated, criminalizing giving a ride or renting to an undocumented immigrant. So that would also affect non-immigrants, right? Citizens who had friends, were married to undocumented immigrants and potentially could put them in jeopardy of being arrested themselves. Criminalized day laborers' First Amendment right to solicit work, criminalized making contracts with undocumented immigrants. This is really dangerous in the sense that when an immigrant signed a contract with someone, but if they were undocumented, it could be ruled void by the courts, and thus they would have no recourse to arbitrate anything in that contract. So contracts were meaningless at that point. Making a criminal, it also made a criminal misdemeanor for an unauthorized immigrant to fail to carry immigration documentation. We call that the Scarlet Letter provision. And the law required Alabama to, oh no, that's the next one. Alabama required to publish an online list of undocumented immigrants who are detained and who appear in court in Alabama. So they were going to create a website listing all the folks who have been demonstrated to be undocumented. And that just makes it really threatening and dangerous for our community. Now, folks organized, folks marched, folks rallied, and really demonstrated their concern with the law, right? And one of the silver linings of HB 56 is that it awakened the community. That you had folks who had previously tried to remain in the shadows to avoid bringing attention upon themselves. It forced them to come out of the shadows and then say, this is not right, right? You see one of the signs there, it says, stop Juan Crow, right? So this notion that immigrants and Latinos in particular were being targeted, and that the rules were different for this community than they were for other folks. So you saw quite a bit of marches during this time period, and you saw a lot of support be garnered for the immigrant community. And ultimately you saw folks flee too, though. There was a lot of fear and concern. And so in the initial weeks of when the bill passed, a lot of folks left Alabama. 10 years later, things have stabilized. Folks have come back for the most part. We have a growing and flourishing community. Um, Luckily, the harshest provisions are no longer active, but there are still remnants of it that really make life difficult, and that we continue to advocate for their removal. If we go to the next slide, please. That's just more examples of folks protesting the law. Okay, so now I want to take the opportunity to talk to you all about HICA, right? HICA is the Hispanic Interest Coalition of Alabama. Jill has already read our mission, but we really pride ourselves in being a facilitator and bridge. We build bridges between communities. So if we go to the next slide. Our vision is that we envision Alabama in which everyone has full and equal participation in our state's civic, cultural, social, and economic life. Hispanic and immigrant families are empowered to integrate, engage, and lead their families, lead their communities to reach their families' aspirations. Now, someone may be asking, what is immigrant integration, or what do we mean by that? Integration is a dynamic two-way process in which new Americans, immigrants, and the receiving society work together to build secure, vibrant, and inclusive communities. So we know that immigrants, when they arrive here, they learn how to navigate systems and overcome barriers. They learn English, they go to college and enter the workforce. They build assets and open businesses and become civically engaged members of their communities. It just means that they become fully participating members of anywhere they live. And what HICA advocates for in terms of the receiving society is that it create a welcoming environment by removing barriers and provide access to opportunities and resources for integration, such as bilingual services, ESL programs, civics classes, naturalization, workforce development, educational scholarships, and supporting immigrant entrepreneurs and protection for our most vulnerable immigrants. This is how we imagine our work at HICA to work. We place it on a continuum in which we have 4 major programs. The first of which is Strong Families, and where we have information and referrals. And from there, they can learn how to navigate the system. Then we provide immigration legal services, helping people gain immigration benefits so that they can adjust their status whenever eligible. We provide education and civic engagement. And finally, make sure they're on the path to financial stability. And this is how we create a full and vibrant society. So let me get more specific into the 4 major programs that HICA has. So Strong Families program, we desire to build a strong and resourceful Latino community, right? So that means building bridges with other community organizations, empowering women in leadership development, empowering families in crisis, training law enforcement officials. One of the most important things that we do is train law enforcement. So what does that mean? That we go and talk to new officers and talk to them about cultural competency, but also not just competency, because it's not just a class that you could check off and say, oh, I now know that culture, but also cultural humility, right? How does one engage with someone who is different from yourself, right? How do you really understand what makes them tick, and how do we better serve one another? And we do this also with government agencies. And it's a really powerful opportunity for us to demonstrate to our community, okay, these folks are here to help you and provide services. And then we turn around and say, this is how you best serve this community, right? Okay, we go to the next slide. Our citizenship and immigration program believes in creating opportunities through citizenship. There is very few things as transformative as naturalization. right? Because that opens the doors for everything in terms of really being able to thrive in our country, right? In which nothing is supposed to be denied to you. As we know, there are barriers and disparities still there, but citizenship is really the gateway by which folks really can be integrated fully into our communities. So we naturalize new US citizens, we place lawful permanent residents on the path towards citizenship. We support the renewal of DACA applications. So that's folks who, while they are not legal permanent residents or citizens, have legal status in this country, are able to go to school and and are able to work legally in the country. So we support the expansion of these programs and of course support a pathway towards citizenship. And then we provide humanitarian visas to survivors of crimes, right? So any victim of crime is eligible to become or earn a visa that allows them to stay in the country as long as they cooperate with law enforcement. So we work with law enforcement for folks who have been victims of crime to be able to stay in the country. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, we have our Empowering Communities program, and that's where we really emphasize our advocacy work, right? How we grow the next generation of leaders. There we house our college access work. So we prepare our Latinx youth to enter college and also other post-secondary educational opportunities, right? Because we have to make sure that folks are able to enter the workforce at various places to make sure that they're able to achieve their aspirations. We also award academic scholarships. We help organize Latino communities, and we're in partnership with other organizations that organize. So there's the Alabama Coalition for Immigrant Justice, which does great work. We partner with the Adelante Alabama Workers Center and other folks who are serving our community so that they know their rights, so they know what they're capable of doing, and to continue empowering to be leaders within their own communities. We also are currently building a more robust policy program, right, in which we are going to begin making recommendations as to what policies can be changed in Alabama to better address the racial disparities that exist and that face our community. We also ensure that Alabama's Latino population will be counted for the 2020 census. We're part of the Hard to Count Collaborative, which is a partnership of 5 statewide organizations working to make sure that folks who are hard to count, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, immigrants, low income folks, and children 0 to 5 are counted in the census. This is critical for us. And then of course, we ensure that our population and our community is engaged in the electoral process. So we have voter registration drives, and we also make sure that we get out the vote. This year in particular is critical that we mobilize our community. Finally, our 4th program is the Community Economic Development Program. We support Latino entrepreneurs by helping them open small businesses. Every year, we help about 35 to 40 folks open new businesses in Alabama. It's fantastic to see how folks who go from being laborers to entrepreneurs transform their lives and the fates of their families, right? And so it's one of the most important things that HECA does. We also, just last year, started a microloan program. We were able to award about $40,000 worth to 17 businesses, 15 of which were women owned. And we've had a fantastic repayment rate. And this is going to get us on the track of becoming a community development financial institution. So we want to be a CDFI so that we serve folks who can't go to traditional banks, can't go to traditional financial institutions, and we want to be an alternative to payday lenders. We also provide comprehensive technical assistance for Latino entrepreneurs. We are a VITA site, which means that we help people file their taxes for free, right? And so a lot of myths and misconceptions about our community is that immigrants don't pay taxes. That is not true, right? There is such a thing as the individual tax ID number, and we help folks register for those and make sure that they pay their taxes. And finally, we provide counseling for prospective homeowners, right? We have the only HUD certified bilingual person in the state at HICA. Okay, now that's what we always do. That's our 24/7, 365 days a week work that we do. But I wanted to touch upon a little bit about how HICA has responded to the pandemic, right? We immediately started working remotely in March and pivoted so that we could provide our services remotely, but also by curbside assistance. And we saw some immediate needs rise out of the pandemic, right? So food insecurity was a primary concern. We established a food pantry, and since March, really the first week of April, we've distributed over 400 food boxes to families. We also provide rental assistance and utilities assistance for folks who have lost their jobs and have seen their wages diminish. So we've been able to provide over $60,000 in rental and utilities assistance. Of course, language access continues to be an issue, especially as information around the pandemic started coming out from the public health agencies. Most of it initially was in English. HICA immediately started translating all of this material in Spanish to make sure that our community had the information they needed so that they could protect themselves and their families. And we also engaged with the city of Birmingham to translate all of their official announcements around the pandemic. And finally, we're currently in conversations to become a testing site. HICA is a trusted community agency and folks already come to our building. So we're developing a plan so that we can also become a testing site. And then given the current turmoil that is really at the crux of what's going on in our country right now, we always see ourselves as a social justice organization. But just yesterday, we put out this statement on what's going on. And so I just want to take the time to read that. The past few weeks have weighed heavily on our hearts. As we work to combat the health disparities of COVID-19, the high-profile murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd have brought to the forefront of our collective consciousness the brutality that our Black brothers and sisters encounter in their lives. We have listened to our Black coworkers, family members, friends, and neighbors, and mourn with them. We lament and condemn the unnecessary loss of life. We understand the systemic and institutional racism permeate these acts of injustice. We understand the need to stand together as communities of color. We understand the need of raising our voices on the streets and at the ballot box as we rally, march, and vote for a better future. For over 20 years, HICA has worked to bridge communities and to dismantle divisions. We will continue to do so, but we also commit ourselves to doing more. We commit ourselves to standing in support of our Black family members, friends, and neighbors. We commit ourselves to celebrating Afro-Latinidad. We commit ourselves to combating anti-Blackness in the Latinx community. And we commit ourselves to advocating for justice for the Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, Muslim, and LGBTQ communities. I want to expound upon that just a little bit in the sense that even within the Latino community, we also struggle with racism. And so HICA wants to make sure that we take a stance to combat racism within our own communities. And we also are committed to embracing Afro-Latinos, right? Because Latino is not a race. We are an ethnic group. But Latin America is racially diverse, right? We have folks who came from Europe, folks who were forcibly migrated across the Middle Passage into Latin America. And then of course we have our indigenous populations and all of their descendants, many of which are racially mixed. But we want to honor those folks and make sure that we celebrate Black Latinos as well. Now I want to end with this little slide about the challenges that we face in Alabama and how there are parallels with the struggles of Black Americans and Latinos in this country and in this state, and how there have been attempts to discriminate against our community, and that we see ourselves as allies and folks in communion with African Americans to make sure that we improve the situation for all folks who live in Alabama, for all its residents. Thank you. I think that that's my PowerPoint. And so I'm happy to have an open conversation about all the things I talked about.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Carlos, for sharing what HICA does here in the state of Alabama. We have a few questions for you, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Our first question has to do with how has the fear of ICE deportation impacted the Latino population in response to the COVID pandemic, excuse me.
Sure. I think that, the biggest problem with ICE and how it deals with our community is that it breeds fear and distrust of government, right? And then that distrust of government then gets it impacts how our community deals with any official authority, whether it's hospitals, whether it's the Jefferson County Health Department, whether it's the Alabama Health Department. And so folks aren't sure who they can believe, right? And if in terms of testing, then am I supposed to go to UAB or any other place where they're testing? And they're gonna ask me for my information. How is our community to know that that information that was now collected won't be passed over to ICE? And so we have to do a lot of work, believe me, a lot of work to first talk to folks who are doing these testing about what are they going to do with that information, right? Is it really necessary to collect this information? So we're always advocating, what is the purpose, right? And you have to convince us that you're not going to pass that information along so we can then go and say it is safe. You can go get tested. Please go get tested. And so as a public health crisis, what ICE and deportations does is it breeds mistrust between the community and government and law enforcement. And so that's a daily battle that we fight.
Thank you. The second question, what are you advising the Dreamers to do in preparation for the Supreme Court's announcement of its upcoming decision, which will impact the Dreamer?
Sure. I think that there's a lot of young folks, right, our dreamers who are trying to figure out what that means for themselves. We at HICA are trying to figure out what to do. One of the things that we definitely want to do is encourage everyone to renew right now. They are still eligible for and have the ability to renew their DACA right now. And so there are folks that even if their DACA won't expire till early next year, they can renew today. Right. And so first of all, we need them to know that they can renew. Second of all, we need to advocate for institutions, especially higher ed education institutions, to figure it out and step up. It is time that they step up for our community and see how they are going to serve the folks that they have told that there is a place for them at this institution. So if there is a freshman, sophomore, and they have already been at the institution should now not turn its back on these young folks who are trying their best to be fully contributing members of our community.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Okay, thank you. The next question, what other organizations do you partner with to execute your mission?
Oh, we have a lot of partners. I mean, I think HICA 20 years in has become a real place where a lot of folks come to us for everything and anything having to do with Latinos in the state, right? So if it's Alabama Arise, Greater Birmingham Ministries, ACIJ, like I mentioned earlier, the Voices for Alabama's Children. I mean, we're on every single major, I think, network that we can be on. So we're on a C3 table working with folks all day. And so there is no lack of partnerships. We pride ourselves in making sure that we are able to advocate for our community and that folks who want to serve our community are able to work with us to make sure that they can also provide services and empower our community.
How has the recent hardline immigration stance on the federal government impacted your ability to provide your services to Hispanic families?
You know, I think it's interesting. We have to take into account that Alabama is a conservative red state, right? Yet we're surviving here for 20 years. And we have grown, right? Alabama, HICA started as an organization with one person, our founder, Isabel Rubio, and now is an organization with 25 employees, right? And so we continue to thrive. But that also tells me that it's Alabama's folks who support HICA, who support the work that we do, right? So look, Donald Trump and his administration have attacked our community, right? His rhetoric has inflamed discrimination, has really endangered our population. Yet every day there are folks who come and want to work with HICA, right? So while it makes it challenging because there are certain folks who just don't want immigrants here, there are plenty of others who value their neighbor, who see the inherent humanity of just of folks in their community. These are people that we go to school with. These are people who we go to work with. These are people we eat with alongside at restaurants, at parks. And I'm always hopeful, regardless of the rhetoric, that we can make community, right? Because at the end of the day, we just want the same things. And we want dignity, and we want respect, and we want to value each other. And so there are folks who want to make a lot of noise and make a lot of hay. And even today, right, you see that. And there are horrible things happening in our country. At the same time, alongside that, there are great people doing great things, trying to fight to make our country a better place.
What can we do as ordinary citizens to assist the organization in its mission?
Well, I think there's a variety of things, right? And I'll just be upfront. One, if you can, give your money. It's just, donate, please. It doesn't have to be to HICA, though we'll happily accept any donations. But give to any organization you truly care about. I think we live in extraordinary times. So if there's an organization you care about and you value the work they are doing, please give to those organizations. If you can't give money, give your time, right? Go volunteer, right, at these organizations. Get to know the community that live in your neighborhoods, right? Because I can guarantee you that you know people who are Latino. I mean, just look at the back of any restaurant that you go to, right? There's folks there, any construction site. Our community is working and is a vibrant part of that, right? I think that there's also the ability to advocate on our behalf, right? Now, I'll be honest, I can advocate, I'm happy to advocate, but sometimes folks who are listening today or folks who have a certain talent or opportunity to sit on important tables can advocate on our behalf when we can't. And so I want to encourage folks to advocate at their jobs, at their workplaces, their offices, their boardrooms, and to their local elected representatives and tell them that there are ways to make this better. And the best way to make things better is to embrace and welcome immigrants.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, our next one, illegal immigrants who are victims of crime immune from being deported if they seek protection or want to report a crime?
First, we'll say undocumented. So, you know, and I'll talk quickly as to why we don't use the word illegal, right? Okay. So illegal is it only seems to stick to my community, right? There are folks who break laws every single day, right? Whether they rob something, they murder someone, they, whatever they do, you never call those folks illegal. Now, crossing the border without authorization then seems to brand my community as illegal, and then it criminalizes an act that for the most part is a misdemeanor, right? And so then when folks talk about my community, they're like, oh, those are criminals. They broke the law, right? And then you lose sight of all humanity when the actual issue is that they crossed the border without authorization. If we can address that, then let's address that, right? And so that's why we choose to say undocumented. Now, to the actual question, if someone is a victim of a crime and they are able to cooperate with law enforcement, they become eligible, but they are not guaranteed. They become eligible to receive a humanitarian visa, which may protect them from deportation. But it's a very long process, right?
Okay, the next question. How can members of the African American community show solidarity within Latinx communities in Alabama? Did I get that right?
I mean, I think I'm a big champion for Black and Brown relations, right? I think that Black and Brown communities should see each other in communion. We should see that for the most part, our interests align, right? And that when they win, we win. When we win, they win, right? And that if we're talking about rights, if we're talking about access, if we're talking about criminal justice, if we're talking about poverty, we live in communities that are facing similar struggles, not the same, and that we have different historical legacies, but they're similar enough that we should come together, and that together we would be stronger. So how can folks in the African American they can lift their voices as well, and as we are responsible for lifting our voices for the struggles that face the Black community. And so I think that we should just go to bat for one another.
Gotcha. Okay. Are there any HICA partnerships in Florida?
In Florida, we're part of a network. We're part of several national networks and regional networks. There's a group called the Southeastern Immigrant Rights Network that has a collection of immigrant organizations as part of their thing. There's a FLIC, the Florida Immigration Coalition. That's the one that comes straight to my head right now. But yes, there's several immigrant rights orgs, and it should be a matter of looking them up.
I'm trying to see if we have any other questions for you, Dr. Carlos. Second. No, that's it. Okay. I don't think we have any more questions for you. We want to thank you again, Dr. Carlos, for agreeing to speak with us tonight on these important and timely issues. We want to also thank the audience for tuning in into our Zoom conference, and we would like you to know that we have one more additional speaker next Wednesday. And so we'll be sending information out for informational flyers. As your screen shows, the website where additional information can be obtained about the speaker series and the commission work. This screen will be up for about 15 minutes, and be sure to visit our Facebook page to keep abreast of ongoing activities. Again, thank you. Dr. Carlos Alamo, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciated it.
Thank you.